Director of Shelter. Lady Masham has a doughty record of campaigning for people with handicaps and disabilities of many kinds, and we're very grateful that she has given the time to come tonight, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great pleasure to be here and to be able to congratulate the South Yorkshire Housing Association for so many excellent schemes for many different groups of people. I thank you for inviting me to your 20th anniversary celebration dinner. I have had the pleasure of officially opening some excellent housing association projects in different parts of the country, and also visiting many. There is no doubt housing associations have so often raised the standards of housing for many charities which otherwise would not have been able to accomplish their aims without the help of housing associations. For many years, I have been president of the Yorkshire Association for Disabled People. We have come a long way. In the early days, St George's, as the house was called, was an ex-police orphanage. The disabled people had little privacy and slept in dormitories, but did have lovely grounds and a swimming pool and plenty of room for sports. This had to be sacrificed for a housing scheme which incorporated integrated housing for both able-bodied and disabled people, and a hostel for the very disabled who cannot manage to live independently. But they all have their own rooms and privacy, and a shelter workshop for those who wish. There are many people now living in their own house with help coming in, which without the Housing Association's help would not have been able to happen. No disabled person is the same, and to give independence very often means the very greatest bit that they want more than anything else. One mistake I have often seen, both in special housing schemes and hotels, are low bars and low basins. Some well-intentioned people think because someone is sitting in a chair, these should be low. There is nothing more difficult than getting out of a low bar. A low bed is no better for a severely disabled person. So many disabled people find well-intentioned adaptations that stop them getting to a facility altogether, like 2 fixed rails on either side of a lavatory. It is so useful to have trained people who can advise on these matters. And many local authorities now have access officers. If I can deviate for one moment to give you an example of how difficult it is to get information. My brother-in-law, who's a solicitor, is clerk of the parish council, and the council wanted to get some dropped ramps and curbs for people using wheelchairs. And as we now have many elderly people in our community and more coming along, this is a very important aspect for disabled living. Anyway, he asked me to find out about these dropped curbs, so I rang the local council. And I found out that there wasn't an access officer, and this is in North Yorkshire. The social services said no, they didn't know anything about it, but I was put through to the planning department, and I spoke to somebody who said, well, I'm not sure about curbs, and this was a surveyor. I'm not sure if they come under parish or county. I'll let you know. I'm still waiting. But a dropped curb is really a very important thing, not only for disabled people, but for elderly people with shopping baskets, walking frames, and all these sort of things, and also people with pushchairs. Sheltered housing is of so much benefit to very severely people. And I wanted to just tell you a story about a young tetraplegic man. A tetraplegic is somebody who has a neck injury and is paralyzed from the neck down. He lived in a house with his mother, and then his mother died of cancer. He continued living in the house until he had an accident, and I was called in by a friend to help. What happened was, he fell between his wheelchair and his bed, and this friend of his, who was actually a paraplegic, telephoned him several times and could get no reply. So in the end, she called in the police, and they broke down his door and went in, and they found him lying on the floor, and he had been there for 48 hours. What happened was, he sustained a very bad pressure sore, and pressure sores can be a killer. He was taken to the district hospital nearest where he lived, and they performed several operations, but it went wrong. And this is where I was called in, and I founded 18 years ago the Spinal Injuries Association to help people in these sort of circumstances. And I managed to get him transferred to a spinal unit where his sores were properly treated, and he was able to live. But it had a happy ending. He then went out to a sheltered house run by a housing association, and he is now married. So it had a happy ending. But some people do live in really very dangerous situations. Another very high lesion tetraplegic, who I knew and who was one of our family members, he had broken his neck as a young schoolboy playing rugby. And he lived again with his mother, and he worked for an association which dealt with technical equipment for disabled people. His mother became very severely disabled through arthritis, and one day he told me that he didn't want to go into residential care. This was the last thing that he wanted. Sometime later, he was found drowned in his lily pond in his garden. Nobody knew how that young man actually got in to the lily pond, because he had no use in his arms and his hands at all. But somehow he managed it. This is why it is important that those people who want to live independently can do so with help coming into their homes. And this is why there are schemes like the Crossroads Care Attendance Scheme, which are so vitally important to these people. For many years, I have chaired an organisation called Phoenix House, which actually is an organisation providing special houses for people who have problems of drug addiction and want to be rehabilitated. It can be a hard and difficult road, which often has a slippery slope, and they have to be lifted up and climb again. Not long ago, Phoenix House became a housing association. Now, Phoenix House is the largest residential drug rehabilitation charity in the United Kingdom, with centres in London, Sheffield, Tyneside, the Wirral, Bexhill and Hull. Phoenix House is currently developing new services for Scotland, 2 new family units for Sheffield and Tyneside, and the Fountain, a centre in South London for people with AIDS. The centres operate as therapeutic self-help communities. Residents do their own cooking and housework, gardening and simple maintenance under supervision. At the same time, they participate in counselling and group therapy sessions, which enable them to come to terms with their problems and lead healthy, fulfilling lives without drugs. The length of the therapeutic program varies according to the need of the individual client, but generally lasts from 9 to 15 months. The first 6 months of the program are spent within the self-help community, developing life skills and working through the emotional and personality problems which led to and developed from drug misuse. This can be a very tough and cathartic and requires very honest self-appraisal and coming to terms with oneself as a person. When the individual client and his or her caseworker feels that he or she has benefited sufficiently from this part of the programme, the client moves to one of Phoenix House's halfway re-entry houses. In re-entry, clients live in bed-sitting style, each with their own room, each with personal responsibility for their own budgeting and cooking, under the supervision of the re-entry staff team. During this phase of the programme, they are encouraged to look outwards towards the opportunities society has to offer. The family unit at Phoenix House, London's project, was opened in 1987 and has proved so successful that another unit was opened in Home in 1990. And 2 further family units are currently in development in Sheffield and Tyneside, and the Sheffield unit is hopefully opening this week. Phoenix House was established 22 years ago and is committed to developing and adapting its services to the changing needs of people with drug and other substance misuse problems, and to working with other agencies to achieve its objects. There is a problem. Drugs are increasing, and this, I can assure you, is happening right through the country. I am pleased to say I have a rehabilitation house named after me in Hull. Masham House is a re-entry house for prisoners. There is no doubt that if there were not these sort of facilities, many people would not survive for long after being institutionalized. A little support often goes a long way at a time when it is needed. I congratulate you for all the work you do, giving good housing to many people who otherwise might be in very inadequate places. There is no doubt making people aware of the many needs of disabilities, whatever they are, should be an ongoing process. Nobody ever knows when they will be disabled themselves. Thank you very much.
Sheila McKechnie has been director of Shelter for, well, since 1985, whatever that makes. She came to the directorship of Shelter after the period in which the Housing Association had close contact with Shelter, but we have retained our interest and concern for all the activities of Shelter, and we're looking forward to hear what she has to say to us.
Thank you very much. I hope some of you who were involved in the early years have noticed that Des Wilson no longer runs Shelter. Slight problem I have with the media. When John asked me to do this, I said to him, "Oh, you don't want me as an after-dinner speaker. I think I've only done it about once in my life beforehand. I'm more noted for giving people indigestion than helping them with indigestion." And he said, no, we're not like that at South Yorkshire Housing Association. I said, well, what do you want me to say? And he said, you can say anything you like. And I thought, this is not an invitation to be turned down. Because much of my job, as many of you will realise, is talking to people about housing who understand very little about it. And in many ways, I have to keep, one, my temper under control, which I assure you is not easy. Two, my anger. Because, like all of us in housing, anger is a great driving force, but it's a terrible means of communication. And the luxury of being able to say not only what I like, but how I like, is what I'm able to do. When I came to Shelter, the organisation in many ways seemed to me to be a bit more like the home for the campaignless than the campaign for the homeless. And my early years, I have to say, were not that easy. And some of the cultural changes that Shelter has gone through are not actually that different from some of the changes that you've had to deal with, particularly since 1988. And I'm one of those converts to management, you know, real bores, you know, staff appraisal, quality initiatives, all the rest of it. And I'm in no way ashamed of that, because commitment these days is simply not enough. None of us working in this sector can afford to waste a penny. And that's the reality we live with, and I think it's quite right. And there are many things that I have to do as Director of Shelter, which in some ways I would choose not to be so reasonable. But the only criteria by which I judge Shelter is the one that you should judge yourself by, which is, are you delivering what people want? And I think it's worth on your 20th anniversary just thinking about why you're all in housing. And some years ago, I sat down with Shelter and said, right, what is it we really believe in, and what is it we want? It's too simple just to say everybody has a right to a home. I believe that. Most people in this room believe that. But that's not enough. We have to look at what's actually been happening in Britain to our housing system. And the way we approached it was to say, what would a housing system look like if it was working the way that Shelter wanted it to work? Well, it would meet 4 basic criteria. It would meet need, i.e. there would be enough homes for people that need them. It would be affordable, which is not a full issue in the housing associations at the moment. It would be fair, and this is the one that might surprise you, it would be socially and economically sustainable. Because nobody is going to marginalise people like me and organisations like Shelter by saying they're simply woolly-headed idealists. Yes, we're all against sin, at least some kinds of sin. We might not share a definition. We're all for people having the right to a home. Oh, yes. But I want my mortgage interest tax relief, folks. I want that before I want a fair housing system. And I think we're up against quite a few difficulties. And I just want to say a few things about each of these areas. Because I think reflecting on what's happened since about the mid-70s, if we had set about designing a housing system that was the least successful that you could imagine in meeting my 4 criteria, you couldn't do much better than the one we got. Somebody coming from Mars would think that we had all gone stark, raving mad. In terms of meeting need, I mean, I remember listening to Richard Best, who used to come out with this thing that a house built today would have to last, at current rates of replacement, would have to last 950 years. I think there's only one house in Britain standing that has lasted more than 950 years, and it's going to stand for another 950. I mean, some of the stuff we built 20 years ago isn't actually going to even last through the next few years. That calculation, you can't even do it these days in terms of the rate of replacement of the housing stock. The numbers of people now on waiting lists for council housing, the number of people on housing association waiting lists, the number of people that are living in poor quality accommodation. I mean, the next English House Condition Survey, or the medium update that's going to come out in a few months' time, is going to show again well over 1 million people living in homes that are classified as unfit for human habitation. You've got young people on the streets of Sheffield. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, you didn't have that. You don't need me actually to spell out what's happened. But even people in housing, I think, don't understand the depth of the cuts in housing. By 1982, housing alone had taken over 85% of total public expenditure cuts. We are spending something like 40% on housing now in comparison to what we were about 77, 78. You notice I choose my years rather carefully. I have not said 1979, because the cuts actually started before that. And that's one of the big problems. People without homes are not actually the most vociferous in our community. And people who are homeless don't necessarily understand that it's because of those cuts that they're homeless. People don't understand the term, the housing system. I mean, I can talk about it in a room like this, but out there, it's fairly meaningless. People just have housing problems. And they don't quite understand what's gone wrong. Well, in the late 70s, we were bringing on stream, housing association movement, councils, we were bringing on stream not much short of 200,000 rehabilitated and new houses a year. I mean, don't believe all this claptrap about 50,000 new homes next year in the housing association movement. Yeah? It's not going to happen. And it's certainly not going to hit 150,000, as was stated in the government's manifesto. We're down now to virtually nothing in the council sector, and we'll be lucky if we meet about 35,000 this year in the housing association sector. Lots of arguments about the figures. Affordability. At a time when people's wages at the bottom of the scale are going down, housing prices are going up. Housing is no longer affordable for a whole generation of young people. And the split is roughly about 40. You know, if you're over 40 and you were in a home of your own, or you were in a rented council house, or a council house that you could buy, you've done all right, thank you very much, in most cases. And you've done it, and we've all done it, by depriving our children of the same opportunity. Some of you might have heard me tell you this story before, but it's at the root of the affordability issue, and I don't make any apologies for telling it again. I once went to a meeting in a place called Masham, and at the time, you would be lucky if you could buy a garage in Masham for £50,000, far less something that you would want to live in. And the good burghers of Masham were having a meeting about how are we going to house the young in Masham. Now, I have to say, the good burghers of Masham weren't necessarily talking about the same young people that you and I are talking about, but they were concerned, so give them credit for that. And in the course of the meeting, I couldn't resist this comment, I nearly got thrown out. I said, this is a very interesting meeting. You're all asking me how to get around the government's housing policy, your government's housing policy. And I was told, Sheila, this is not a political meeting. So I behaved myself for the rest of the meeting. And afterwards, one of the people from the housing committee came up to me and he said, oh, Sheila, I know it's true, I know what you're saying. He said, my son's earning 17,000 a year, and his daughter's earning about 10,000 a year. She was a nurse, she certainly wasn't earning much more than that. And between them, they cannot afford to buy a house in Masham. Isn't it dreadful? So I said, where do you live in? And he said, oh, we've all heard this story, even in Yorkshire, we've all heard it. Somebody, the taxi driver that picked me up told me it tonight. No, not the person, sorry, the taxi driver at London, not the person from South Yorkshire who came to meet me at the station on my ad. He'll never forgive me. about 40 million. It'd be worth a wee bit less now. And I said to him, and you're asking me why your sons got problems? Can't you see the connection? You had the right lottery ticket in the right place at the right time. Your numbers come up. But at what price? The other story, just to prove that I'm not politically biased, was in a Labour authority, again, unfortunately, somewhere near London. And again, it was a local councillor, and he told me this story. He was the shop steward in the local factory, and one of his members came up to him one day and said, "See, you lot in the council, I know you're opposed to this right to buy, but I've got a right to buy my house and I want to buy my house." So the councillor said, yes, you have, and I'll sort it out for you. So he went off and the chap bought his house. And about 6 months later, the same man came to him and said, "See, you lot on the council," I don't know how many councillors there are here tonight, but so it's an even more refined form of masochism than being director of shelter. "See, you lot on the council, what are you up to? My son," it's always the son, "my son's been on the waiting list for 3 years. When are you going to get him a house?" And the councillor turned around to him and said, "We're not, you bought it." And that same person's children who bought the house, and I'm only making the point, I mean, you'd have been stark raving bonkers not to buy it if you were in that position as a tenant. You'd have been stark raving bonkers in the early 80s not to buy if you could afford it. You'd have been economically illiterate if you hadn't. But it doesn't change the underlying point that I and a lot of people in this room are of the generation who got into the pink trough and who actually made it impossible for our children to have the same opportunities that we have. And we have made their housing unaffordable by our collective greed. Now, saying that doesn't exactly make me very popular. As a director of charity, a charity, when I'm going around with a hat, I'm supposed to be nice to all these people in order that, you know, they can feel, they can salve their conscience and their capital gains of over £100,000, £200,000 and give a donation to shelter. Well, I'm very grateful for that donation. But it won't stop shelter saying the kind of things that need to be said. And that's one of the things about affordability that needs to be said. It is not just the immediate problems of the 1988 Act. It is not just the problems of the right to buy and the decline in local authority building. It is not just the fact that we've had a government that has gone down the route of saying public is bad, private is good. Mortgage interest tax relief is an obscenity in terms of who gets it and who it subsidises and what happens to it. We are the only country in Western Europe where the better off you are, it's less true now since the top rate was abolished, but it's still true, the better off you are, the higher level of subsidy you get from the state. Mortgage interest tax relief is one of the most unfair subsidies that we have ever had in this country. And funnily enough, after a decade of talking about targeting benefits, giving that little pot of money to those that need it most, the one huge amount of public subsidy that has remained unscathed by the argument for targeting is myriad. It is a complete anomaly in terms of every other aspect of government policy. And I don't mind saying that. To abolish it now would be catastrophic if you did it overnight and in the short term, but it doesn't remove the principle. To them that have, give a bit more. And the impact of that on people who do not have is that they quite simply are unable to have a home. And the people who lose out are always the people who lose out. People who are disabled and want to live independently. Because people in their 20s and their 30s living at home with their parents, because there is nowhere else for them to go, are as homeless as the categories of people that we normally consider homeless. A home is somewhere that's yours, not somewhere that somebody else decides you are going to be put up with it and you're lucky to have it. The discrimination in housing that exists in relation to black people and people from the other ethnic communities. There has not been a single study in this country done in the public or the private sector on racial discrimination that has not shown systematic discrimination. It exists. It exists in a lot of organisations that actually think they're doing very well. Our housing system is not fair, and the people on the receiving end of that unfairness are the least able to fight back. And then the one that I said you might think was a bit surprising, economically and socially sustainable. Well, I think that can be very easily illustrated, particularly at the moment. Let's take a building worker who's unemployed, lost a family home as a result of mortgage repossession. That family could be living in bed and breakfast at an average cost, if you take the cost to the local authority and if you count in the subsidy from central government, at an average cost in England of £17,000. Add on to that the cost of income support for that family, and you're talking about somewhere between £6,000 and £8,000. Add on to that the corporation tax that has been lost as a result of the company that that builder worked for going bankrupt. And you could actually have a little pot of money, somewhere between £20,000 and £30,000. There are very few people in this room who could not actually survive. Mind you, some of you might not be kept in quite the style that you're accustomed to. But most of us could survive on an income of somewhere between 20 and 30,000. It is complete and utter economic madness. What happened to Britain in the 80s was largely to do with housing. Deregulation, people borrowing money, banks, building societies, making it very easy for people to borrow. I have to say some of the northern building societies were a bit more canny, and they're not in half as much trouble as some of the flash southern ones. But the money was there if you wanted it, 4 times your salary, no questions asked. People were making enormous gains on their housing, and they were feeling rich. Sitting in houses worth £150,000 with a £20,000 mortgage. Come on, Jean, come on, John, let's go out and borrow 20 grand. We'll have that wee BMW that we always wanted. We'll have that timeshare in Spain. And it got out of control. Do you know that in 1987-88, the Bank of England, the Treasury's model for expenditure, consumption, did not include the amount of money that was leaking out housing? And Lawson got the fright of his life. And then, folks, if it's not hurting, it's not working. And companies, big companies, long-established engineering companies, chemical companies in this country, had to go and borrow money for investment at rates of interest that they just couldn't sustain. We have wrecked the industrial base in this country by what happened with the housing market. And we've learned the hard way. And there are now somewhere like between 1 million, take your guess, 2 million people sitting in houses now that are worth less than their outstanding mortgage. And the whole thing is in grave danger of coming apart. And mortgage repossessions won't be any less this year than last year. In fact, there'll probably be more. And we've got repossessed homes sitting empty, deteriorating in bankers' terms at the rate of about £1,000 a month in terms of the damage that's been done to them. And we've got other people living in bed and breakfast and in caravans and in temporary accommodation. The housing finance system that we've got is unsustainable. Unsustainable. And I remember Paul of the Bundesbank once saying, "Oh, we're not having your crazy housing system here in Germany, thank you very much." Well, it would have actually been quite useful to listen to the Germans, at least about housing. It might even have been very useful to listen to the French. They do it slightly differently, but equally effectively. And what they do is they keep housing costs, they keep the housing market stable and housing costs out of mainstream economics in terms of managing the economy. You cannot run a housing system where it is your main lever in terms of controlling the economy. If it's so bad, and if it's so obviously bad, the question that I'm sure you'll be asking me is, why doesn't everybody see that? You know, we're not blessed with the world's most imaginative politicians, but they're not all stupid. Well, I have to tell you that almost every single MP I have ever spoken to about housing finance has not disagreed with some of the things, most of the things I've said, and particularly about MIRAS. But it's always done, as I say, between consenting adults in private. And you're certainly not allowed to say in public who has agreed with you. And they never do it when they're in ministerial office, but they're awfully good at doing it when they leave. It was the first thing that Michael Heseltine did when he left the cabinet, was stick his head above the parapet on doing something about MIRAS. It was the first thing that Clive Solly did when he ceased to be Shadow Minister of Housing. It is an obscenity, and it's worth a lot of money. In 1991 terms, if you had abolished MIRAS, you could have cut income tax by 5 pence in the pound. We're not talking about small sums of money. So what is it about housing? What is it about it that it has ceased to be an area where people want constructive, socially responsible change? Well, it's an act of political cowardice between the two major parties, for very different reasons. The Conservatives, because they don't want the spotlight on the owner-occupied dream going wrong. And the Labour Party, because they are terrified of being accused of being anti-owner-occupied. In an electoral system, in a country like Britain, where you've got 70% roughly people who vote, and by and large, if you keep 42% of them happy, you can tell the rest of them to go to hell and back. You have a real political problem. Nobody is prepared to accept the owner-occupied vote. Nobody is prepared to stand up and say, it is not a good idea for the economy, for the future of this country, for the future of our industry, for the future of our children. For those of you who want to be pensioners and live in this wonderful country, because you're going to have to be awfully rich to insulate yourself from the effects of what's happening in terms of the British economy as a whole. If you're rich enough to take off and live on your proceeds, maybe what I've got to say doesn't really matter. But it's about time we started to have a bit of sense about what a country can and cannot afford. But the politicians are frightened. And in this past general election, housing was absolutely nowhere. So, the lesson for Shelter in all of that is that our purpose is, as it's always been, not just to try and help the homeless, but to say, why are they homeless in the first place, and make politicians face up to some of the hard things that they're going to have to face up to if we're not going to turn a crisis into a virtual disaster. And it's now hitting people that matter politically. Because the homeless don't matter politically, they don't vote. People in bed and breakfast are too busy getting through the day to worry about politics. But it's now hitting lots of people. And it's our job as Shelter to actually make those arguments and get the politicians to understand. But it's your job too. You're not in business just to help the people that you can help. You can do twice, 3 times as much if you actually have the resources. And it's not enough for the housing association movement, having accepted the poison chalice and feeling very sick, to say, oh well, we'll do what we can do. We'll do what we can do. And you know what that's meant for some of them. I think South Yorkshire has very much stuck to its principles. And that was another reason why I was more than happy to come back and talk to you tonight. Because there's a lot of housing associations at the moment that I wouldn't have that much in common with. Now, it's no part of my job to start rows in the housing association movement, and I've kept Shelter well out of some of the issues between local authorities and housing associations. My response generally when I'm asked about, do I believe in that housing associations are better managers than local authorities, or do, you know, who should... Oh, God, it's a bit like moving the deck chairs around the Titanic. Have a lot of fun, folks, but the Titanic is sinking. And that's my job, to actually try and get that message across. And I think what I want to say about that is, we are absolutely useless in the housing industry, and you're part of the housing industry, at delivering the political muscle that we actually have. Think of the last budget. Think of what the motor manufacturers got out of the Chancellor at the last budget. They were the only ones that got anything. And who the hell wants more motor pumps? Everybody wants more houses. We've got a building industry that doesn't seem to be able to deliver muscle. We've got an enormous number of people working in housing. And what do you all do? We've got homeless people themselves in terms of organising that pressure. Can we get anything at the Chancellor? No, we're too busy fighting each other. We're too busy abusing each other on the minutiae, whether special needs management allowance is better than hostel deficit management. Yeah, terribly important in making your project staff calm. But your project for 20 people is a drop in the bucket in terms of what the actual need is out there. So, I think we're all in housing going to actually have to put a lot more effort into how we deliver that pressure. And I think shelter, we do our bit, but we're still relatively small. But my priority for the coming year is to try and get these disparate groups together in a way that begins to deliver some of that political power, people power, to politicians of all parties. And there isn't a bit of paper between us. I mean, there's as many district councils, Conservative district councillors, just as upset about the current housing policy. It's the brick wall in Masham Street and in the Treasury that is the real problem. And I want to just say thank you to John and to the committee, because you're one of the few housing associations that has actually, in recent years, made a substantial donation to the work that Shelter does in that field. And I don't know if you all know this, but when Shelter set you up, and my God, you must have been good to get money out of Des Wilson. Not many people succeeded, you know. He was awfully good at collecting it. He was a lot more careful about getting it out. You got a donation from Shelter to get you going of £3,775. And earlier tonight, I got a donation from you to Shelter of precisely £3,775. And I think that's one of the nicest things that has happened to me in a long time. I know you do a really difficult job, and you're a really important housing association in this part of the world. But I hope some of the things I've said will make you just lift your eyes a little bit from the day-to-day problems and think about the impact that you can have in the wider community by making more people understand about the real depth of the current housing crisis. So my best wishes to all of you for the next 20 years, and be careful out there. Thank you.
A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to my colleagues in the management committee and told them a story of a friend of mine who was an advisor in adult education. I will briefly recount it again. My friend had the opportunity over the course of a number of years of developing a service along with a colleague. And one day his colleague retired, and as happens these days, it was decided his post should not be replaced. So for 3 months, my friend sat and looked at his colleague's desk and his filing cabinet and decided that he couldn't slide 2 jobs into one. So one day he set aside a day and shredded all his files and put them all outside. When I first heard that story, I thought that was terrible. The evidence, the tangible evidence of 15 years of work gone into the bin. But on reflection, I thought, well, if an adult education advisor and an education advisor, his work, the evidence of his work is not in the tangible things that are left, but in the process that has gone on with so many people over the years of his work, and that intangible development that goes on. It would take more than a shredder to destroy the evidence of 20 years of work of the South Yorkshire Housing Association. We have tangible evidence in the housing stock that we have got. But it's a reminder to us that our business is not solely with the production of housing. We may be in the housing industry, but our business is people. And we are so grateful to Lady Masham and Sheila McKechnie for their challenging and inspiring comments to us, reminding us of the challenge that remains to us. We are in a situation where the political climate has handed us opportunities which our founding fathers would never have imagined could come to housing associations. There are dangers to that process, as Sheila has pointed out. We have structured ourselves towards the future. We are not solely nostalgic in looking back to the past and congratulating ourselves on what we have achieved. We have restructured ourselves. We will take advantage of those opportunities. But this is not a nostalgic occasion. It is an occasion where we are repledging ourselves to the ideals, the concerns which gave this association its life. We are still concerned at the outrage of homelessness. We are still concerned that people should have control restored to their lives. We are still concerned that discrimination in housing should be removed as far as we are possible. We are still concerned that people who have severe disadvantages should have housing and should have it with the kind of supportive care that is needed. We are grateful to both of you for the challenging comments that you've made to us. We take it on our hearts. Thank you very much. John.
I'm not going to make a speech. I'm really part of a conspiracy with our finance director, because the longer I keep you here talking, the smaller the bar tab is going to be when we entertain you afterwards. But setting aside the cynicism, I don't think this occasion can pass without some contribution from the oldest inhabitant, because of two areas of thanks I think that have to be made. In the cathedral close of one of our great English cathedrals, there's a memorial tablet, and it says, "Sacred to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel J.H. Maltravers, MC DSO, who was murdered by his battalion at Cornwall on the 8th of October 1868. And with that glorious, pious Victorian ineptitude, underneath is the quotation, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." And those words, I think, come to mind, as I actually represent a lot of people here tonight, and a lot who aren't here tonight, who've worked for us, who've supported us in a number of ways. And, like Sheila, I'm addicted to management now, God help the staff, but I think Sheila and I both realise that results come through people and not through anything by way of hypothesis. And if I was looking for something which summed up the achievements of South Yorkshire, I would say that you need good people to achieve good results. And I would just like to say that overall, South Yorkshire has been blessed down the years with both committee and staff members who have been good and faithful servants. So I make thanks on behalf of all of us in this corporate venture. Now, Sheila rather stolen my thunder about this donation. We had a photo call here at the beginning, and it was all top sacred. We've got to go through it again. Well, here's the cheque, Sheila. If I don't present with that, our lendings loans from the Co-op Bank are going to be a bit abysmal next year. Well, there is a story about how we arrived at this sum. We wanted to make an appropriate donation, and the first thought was it would be appropriate to return to shelter my first year's salary. When we found it, we felt we'd perhaps have to get the services of a microsurgeon to actually get it onto the cheque. And if we'd given it to Sheila, it would look more like an insult than a donation. But again, like a good manager, you'll notice that this sum is coming back to you, not with interest. Nevertheless, in today's terms, it represented an input of something like £40,000. And without that, I wouldn't be here tonight, I think, and there are a lot of people here in their current jobs who would not be with us. And a lot of people down at the time of those 20 years really owe everything to the trust which Shelter put into our first committee members and then into me over the years. And I'm always very proud to talk to people about our shelter origins. It's a bit of shorthand, and this is a bit of nostalgia perhaps, and perhaps I'm totally out of contact. But there is something of a frisson when you say, oh yes, we are a shelter-sponsored association. Because I think there is that campaigning thing still present in the concept of shelter, and it does speak a great deal about people. So those are my thanks, and it's been a glorious occasion, I think, this reunion to see so many old and friendly faces, some new ones. The bar will close at 11 o'clock. Thank you for coming and have a safe journey home. Thank you.